Fly fishing is fun. It really is. It's quiet, peaceful, not a lot of people around, and it's very relaxing. Very relaxing.
It kind of evolved all from having a love for the finished work, and apparently is in my blood because I've always gone back to the canoes.
I started reading some books about fly fishing and went out and got a 7-foot Fenwick fiberglass rod and tried my luck. And for the first 2 or 3 years, to be honest, I didn't catch a damn trout.
And I said, I don't know how it's happened, but I've gone from rolling stones to kidney stones in the blink of an eye.
Yes.
It's like way too fast a ride. How did this happen? But it's been a great ride.
Welcome to Flyline Podcast, where we enjoy the interesting stories behind the legendary guides and luminaries connected to Maine fishing. I'm Michael Jones. Today, we'll be talking with our special guest, Steve Brooke. Steve was born in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and grew up fly fishing, skiing, and exploring nature with his family until they moved to Maine. In the summer months, Steve and his father would make annual trips to Maine to places like Mooselet-Paguntik, Middle Dam, and the Rapid River to fish, paddle, and explore the surrounding and wild places. Steve conducted his undergraduate studies at Colby College and eventually earned his graduate degree in Fine Arts Conservation at the Cooperstown Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works program through New York State College at Oneonta. Steve worked as a Smithsonian Fellow in the National Collection of Fine Arts. This evolved to him coming to the Maine State Museum, where he became a conservator and eventually a chief conservator, where he curated the Maine sporting collection. Think cane rods, unique small boats, as well as antique sporting photos and documents. Steve started a private fine arts consulting business working with local museums and private art collections. Steve has always had an interest in advocacy and environmental issues. It was at this same time that Steve started working with a group of like-minded locals that shared his unique conservation vision. This group ultimately developed into what has become the Kennebec Coalition. In the early years of the coalition, their prime mission was advocating for the removal of the Edwards Dam in Augusta, Maine, to restore that section of river to its original and natural state. In this heartfelt conversation, Steve shares his memories and endeavors that reshaped the future of this unique environmental accomplishment of the Edwards Dam project and other similar projects since. Steve is an extremely motivated individual that is enthusiastic, positive, and understands the power and value of working cooperatively with others, over going it alone. Steve has a motivating message and is always kind and mindful in his delivery. His understanding of the environment and ecology is fun and inspiring to hear and share. And this is why he is a respected and luminous advocate for Maine rivers. Steve lives in Farmingdale, Maine with his equally talented wife Beth and continues his hard work supporting efforts for river restoration and improving habitat for wild native fish through his careful advocacy. It comes with humble personal respect and appreciation to introduce an old friend and friend to the Maine fly fishing community to today's special podcast. Steve, welcome to the Flyline Podcast.
Well, thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to have you here at our home in Farmingdale.
And you built this house.
Yes, with the help of a good carpenter who was a college friend, Leon. And he had one helper, and the three of us framed it up, did it in a year.
And it's a unique home.
Well, it's a solar home. It's a solar envelope house. It was cutting edge technology in 1980 when we built it. And it heats the house, and it has worked very well for us. And we burn wood to stay warm beyond the solar, and it's a very comfortable space. We're sitting up here over the garage and in the office that has been my office for many years, and it's a nice quiet room, and I thought it would be the right place for a podcast.
It is, and I appreciate that, Stephen. Because you just showed it to me, you showed me your grandfather's personal fishing wallet. And I'm going to have some images on our website to share with the audience to see what real traditional wet flies look like.
Yeah.
And thank you for sharing that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, he was Arthur Sherman Phillips. He was a Fall River attorney. And he grew up, he was in the class of 1871 from Williams College as a point of reference. And loved the outdoors. And he loved to fish. And he fished the Maine New Brunswick border with a group of Indian guides And I'm very pleased. I have his fly book, and that's what I showed you. And it's mostly snelled hooks. My dad actually fished some of those hooks in his lifetime. My dad, well, I was born in Colorado Springs because my dad was stationed there for all of World War II. At the end of his terms there, he went to Japan as part of the strategic bombing survey. And when he came back, he was released. And so in the spring of, that would be 1946, he and my mom and I went fishing. I showed you a picture of me sitting on my mother's lap. And that's probably a cutthroat. And that was always called Steve's First Fish.
Yeah, that's great.
Which I thought was a sketch. The reel on Dad's rod that my mother was holding was one of the old spring-loaded fly reels.
Sure.
That as you stripped it out, you wound the spring, and then you had a little lever so it would come in.
The automatic.
Yes, the automatic. And I grew up fishing that reel with him.
Yeah, that's a great. So Steve, I mean, because it's a audio podcast, but Steve did share some beauty, and he was a great photographer. You said shot in Kodachrome.
Yeah, he always shot Kodachrome. I have a number of his slides. He was an outdoorsman. My dad grew up in Providence, Rhode Island, actually in East Providence. My grandfather on his side was a plumber, and he had twin sisters. He loved to escape Providence, and as soon as he was out of high school and started working, he used to take the snow train out of Providence, Rhode Island, every Friday night. And he was part of a group called the Risky Runners, the Rhode Island Ski Runners. And they had a cabin up in Pinkham Notch, and they skied a lot at Cranmore, and the old Cranmore, gondola line.
Of course.
I guess it was the Ski-mobile.
Sounds right.
I remember standing in line with him skiing up there. He loved to ski almost more than anything else. We were living in Massachusetts at the time, and we used to come up and ski the New Hampshire mountains almost every weekend when I was young. So I grew up with him in the outdoors, fishing, skiing. He hunted too, but I never had a chance to hunt with him. He died while I was still at Colby College, and that's one of the things that I missed in my life.
But your father introduced you to skiing.
He certainly did.
And you were an avid skier. I don't know if you still ski.
I was a very avid skier.
Exactly. And we'll talk more about that. Steve, I want to back up just a little bit, if you don't mind. Back to our introduction. I was riding over this morning, and it occurred to me, out of all of the people that I've interviewed in the podcast in the last 2 seasons, I've known you longer than any of them.
That's right.
So I'm going to take you back to a time that you won't remember, but I will.
Okay.
I remember as a older teenager, I'm going to guess 16 or 17, going to Trout Unlimited meetings with my father, and you were there with Bruce
Bowman.
Thank you. Bruce Bowman. I think he might have been the chapter president at that point. And there were a lot of people around the table, but there was a lot going on. And that's one of the reasons that you made such a strong impression on me. You have motivation, enthusiasm. And at the time, I was so impressed with how you were using science to bring out your argument and bring out your point. And we'll talk more about it in the second half. But I want the audience to understand that I've known Steve Brooke for a very long time, and I've always been tremendously impressed with your kindness and just generally what you've tried to do in your legacy working in Maine and with Maine rivers. And that's the reason you're here today.
Well, I haven't finished.
I know you have
more
not.
that's still going.
There is.
But I remember those days. Bruce was one of my mentors. He was Bruce Bowman, who was the president of Trout Unlimited chapter, Kennebec Valley chapter of Trout Unlimited, worked up at the Bangor Mental Health Facility. And he was in charge of the outdoor recreation. But Bruce also was the kindest person, and he was always working for others. He spent time working for all the disabled groups. He was always there. I just can't tell you how much I miss him. He passed a little bit over a year, almost a year ago.
I didn't know that.
And he is one of the people that I remember well and will always respect.
Right. And we'll talk more about some of the TU work that you did. But I want to go back to you mentioned that you grew up in Colorado, but then you moved to New Hampshire?
We actually moved to Maine. My dad was released from the service in the spring of 1946. And they came back to New England. The only place they had to land was my mother's family's summer home in Kennebec Beach. And I grew up summers in Kennebec Beach. I remember fishing with my dad. He had a 12-foot molded plywood boat that he could put on the top of a car.
Yeah.
And we fished off the beaches. We fished out around the spindles. We did a lot of mackerel fishing. But even more important, we used to go down to the river that comes into the beach that's immediately south of Kennebec Beach. And it goes out of Kennebec, and it's got dams on it in Kennebec. But there were shad back then, and there still are shad in that river now.
I'm thinking the Mousam.
It is the Mousam. Thank you. That's the right name.
Yeah.
And so I remember fishing with my dad off the beaches. I remember being caught offshore as a massive, massive fog bank arrived. And we just went full tilt for the beach and ended up going through the surf and up on the beach just because the fog was so thick.
Yes.
Those are the things that you remember in your whole life, and they really make you part of what you are. I grew up in his small boats and paddling canoes and kayaks, and that's why I was so pleased to be able to come and work in Maine.
Let's talk about your paddling. I know you've always been into floating around in a wooden craft, and how did you get introduced to paddle sports?
I was introduced to paddling out on Washington Pond, out in the town of Washington. I went to summer camp out there for several years, and this would have been in the early 1950s. And it was a camp that had a lot of very competitive people, and it was all built around sports and the like, and that's not who I was. So I ended up working with the campcraft people and working paddling, and they were all wood canvas canoes at that time. There were Rangeley boats that we could row, and I fished every evening after dinner. I'd row across Washington Pond to an island that had a lot of bass around it, and I fished over there. I loved sailing. I did a lot of sailing that summer, and I was pretty competitive on the sailing, but that's about as far as it went.
It's funny, I didn't know that. We have a very similar background. I worked at a summer camp as a counselor, and I taught sailing, windsurfing, did a lot of canoeing. There weren't any wooden canoes with canvas anymore at that point, but
it was a really good education.
It's fun stuff too, isn't it?
Oh, it's a marvelous background to have, and all children should have that. Wooden canoes are not like the plastic ones. You can't come and drag them up across rocks. And so you learn how to use balance, how to beach them, walk to the bow, go off while it's still in the water, and then pick it up and pull it up. And that's something that stuck with me, and I do it with all the boats that I've built. And I have a bunch of wooden boats that I've built, but they're all wood epoxy boats, and they're hard as can be, tough, good things. But there was a skill set that I learned that summer, the summers, plural, and it stuck with me. Something else also stuck with me. One of the other groups were there. There were 4 separate groups for age at the camp I went to, and the older kids were the rangers. And they went out and traveled all summer. And so we'd hear stories about their trips at dinner when they'd come back. And one thing that stuck with me is that they all went and got junior Maine guides licenses after their summer event. And that's something that I always had a goal to do. And it's something that I was able to fulfill when I was working for American Rivers. I needed a guide's license because if you're taking people out and you're being paid, you have to have a license. Yes. And so I had a guide's license that I kept for a couple of decades.
Yes. JMG is the term for junior Maine guide.
Well, I actually got a full guide's license.
Right, of course.
And it also included the commercial boating inland water
requirements. Exactly. Yeah.
Those are really good programs, and something that people that spend a lot of time in the outdoors should think seriously about, because it teaches you to not only understand what the rules are, but to be a competent waterman, to know the rules and the right of ways and all. And I see an awful lot of people driving boats around that really shouldn't be out there today.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I, of course, have had my guide's license for most of my adult life, all of my adult life. And I agree 100%. I learn every day. I continue to learn. But thanks for sharing that about your time in the summer camp. I think that definitely set the cast for the person that Steve Brooke turned into. So then you attended Colby College, Steve.
I did. I came to Colby College in the fall of 1963. And it was a nice place to be in the 60s because it was out of the hoopla and a lot of the goings on in the cities. It was the coldest place I'd ever been. The hilltop in Waterville where Colby was, especially during the 2 and 3 weeks of sub-zero cold that we had in those days. It was a very special place to be.
What did you study?
I started out in economics because my dad wanted me to be in economics, and I just wasn't an economist. The best course I took at Colby, it was a business management and an accounting course, and I've used those skills my whole life. But beyond that, I actually wasn't doing well as a student, and I spent a year as a junior year abroad student. I lived in Denmark, traveled in Germany, went from East Germany across Checkpoint Charlie while the wall was up. So I saw a lot of what was going on there. And it was a very, very learning experience. I still speak a little Danish, and I follow what happens in Denmark as a result of that.
Did you have a life experience there that started to put you in a different direction, away from accounting, or?
Well, I knew that I was very capable with my hands, and I liked doing things with my hands. I probably shouldn't have gone to Colby. I should have gone to the North Bennett Street School in Boston and become a woodworker, carpenter, a furniture maker. But that's not what happened, and Colby never told me about that program at the time. I was an art major. I did fine arts. I did a lot of welded steel. I did a little bit of wood carving. I spent one summer up at the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture.
Oh, no kidding.
I was there on a scholarship, and that was when I decided I wasn't going to be an artist either. So I left Colby with a degree in fine arts and a minor in economics, and I went to Philadelphia and got a job in a big printing plant where I was eventually put in charge of the letterpress printing division, technology that is gone.
Sure.
I had, I guess, 9 or 10 men on the crew. There were 4 unions in that group. And it was very interesting to have this kid just out of college working with people his grandparents' age and parents' age. And I learned a lot about how to be in charge, but to be someone's friend and to work with them rather than fight them. And it worked quite well while I was there. But I eventually went to graduate school, and I went to a brand new program at graduate school. It was at that time in Cooperstown, New York. And there was a museum training program in Cooperstown, but this was for fine arts conservation. And what fine arts conservation is it takes what used to be the trade of restoration and added science to the restoration. And I was in the first graduating class from that program. And so the coursework in graduate school was 2/3 classroom, 1/3 laboratory work when you were working on and with the artifacts. And you learned about the mechanics and science of deterioration, why things fall apart, how materials are compatible, how you can try to stabilize that incompatibility, and what the limits are and what you can't do. And the program has since moved on to Buffalo and is now part of Buffalo University. That graduates 10 students a year, as it did back when I was there. But it was a very interesting program that ended up with a year being spent as a Smithsonian Fellow. And I worked at what was then the National Collection of Fine Arts. It's now the National Museum of Art. And I had a master that I was working for who was a German, who was a very interesting person. But you get introduced to the real world of museums very quickly at a large institution like the Smithsonian. So I was able to attend courses at the Smithsonian that were designed for internal staff only. And it was a really important part of my development as a person, but also with my understanding of the profession that I followed for most of my career.
So just for the listeners, Steve, define what an art conservator is.
Well,
And maybe you just did.
yeah, I think that an art conservator is someone that's trained in the science as well as the skill of preserving cultural heritage. Because they're conservators that work on historic buildings. I ran my own business for 10 years working on some of the painted murals. You're from Mount Vernon.
Sure,
You
yes.
probably are familiar with the
Very.
murals that are part of that world. I think those are probably one of the first American landscape schools that have ever, and they can't be shown as that because they're fixed, that they're very hard to move.
Yeah.
And I have moved them. I've taken a set of murals out of a house and shipped them and gone with them to Vermont. So it involves a little bit of engineering. It involves a little bit of carpentry skills and good dexterity skills. It involves color matching skills. It's surprising how many people are colorblind.
Yeah.
And it's surprising how few people have fine motor coordination to work under a microscope
Yes.
on something and to be able to do that type of work. And that's what my formal training was.
It's amazing. Oh, Steve mentioned the murals in Mount Vernon. I'll just mention, I have seen a number of them. Grew up near Dunn's Corner and Wings Mills Road, where there was an old tavern. The building was made in, I want to say, the late 1700s. And it was a traveling artist that would go around and stay at these different places. There was another one over by the Chimney in West Mount Vernon, too. Do you remember where the one that you removed was located, Steve? These are in houses that people,
No, this one was at a home in Reedfield.
Oh, yeah.
And you're talking about the Rufus Porter School of Art.
Yeah.
And he and many others had some stock things that they would do. They had stencils that they would cut, and they worked in a water-based medium. And I've seen them that are just plain, but I've also seen them enormously detailed out. There's a set of murals in Farmington, in the upstairs of a building that's now a commercial building, that Colby wanted me to bring to them. And I convinced them not to do it because they had multiple layers of wallpaper on them. And I couldn't find a way to get the wallpaper off and keep the water-based paint on the walls, so that they'd have had what was mostly a restoration as opposed to the original. But what was unique about the series up in Farmington, it was a picture of the militia on the green, and every face was different. Every face was unique.
Amazing.
So although they worked with stencils, if you were willing to pay for them to stay and to keep going, they could develop a very sophisticated work of art.
Oh, I see.
So the range that's there, from just stenciled walls to stock, just kind of generic landscapes. I worked on one in Westbrook that was in oil medium that had a picture of the falls in Westbrook with salmon in the falls at Westbrook. So that was one of the overmantel scenes.
Yes.
They are truly an unusual work of art, and something that most people don't understand because you can't see a number of them together.
Right.
They're fairly well fixed.
So I think what we're talking about now is, we haven't mentioned, you're now working for the Maine State Museum.
Well, I was back then.
Right.
That's correct. So when in my last months in Washington, the director of the State Museum came down and recruited me to come up and join his staff at the Maine State Museum, which at the time was a building with empty galleries. So I arrived at the Maine State Museum in the fall of 1973. I lived in Hollowell several years. It was in Hollowell I met my wife. I had a friend, we did music, and we were doing music in bars and just having a good time when I wasn't at work at the museum. And he was dating Beth's roommate at the time. And that's how I met Beth.
Hollowell was really cool at that time, wasn't it?
It's always been cool.
It has, but
it's
it was
always been cool. It's always been an arts community,
Yes.
even when it was the antique center of Maine. I think probably 2/3 of the cultural patrimony of the state of Maine was sold through shops in Hollowell.
That's right.
At that time.
Yeah.
Here's something that'll be unusual. I was invited to come over to Beth and Vicky's home with my friend, and we were to bring dinner. And so I brought moose, which was not a legal kill at that time, but it had come from the freezers at the Maine State Museum from a moose that had been taken and mounted at the museum.
Yeah.
And we had moose fondue for dinner. And I bought a pot of oil, and we had lovely moose meat in the nobody'd ever had it before.
No.
And I think it must have made an impression on her.
Oh, I'm sure it did. That's great. But Steve, I do want to go back, if you don't mind, because there's another part of your career that I just, if you don't mind sharing. Can you go back to your museum when you were working with the Maine State Museum? Can you recall any? You were working with old boats. You were working with probably old fish mounts. You were probably working with old cane fly rods made by the historic makers. What do you remember about that?
Well, we were building the Made in Maine exhibit, which was lower 2 floors. And the first thing that the director wanted to do was to have some industries that were part of Maine's culture. And he was thinking about what everybody else thinks about in big museums, silversmithing and gunsmithing, and some of the things that were done in the 19th century. And I said, why don't we focus on the Thomas Rod Company, Bangor, one of the great rod makers. Even Leonard came from Bangor.
Of course.
And so I started assembling information about the culture and what that industry was at the time. And it's fascinating. The people that worked on these cane rods were able to make tapers of bamboo that were down to 1/100 of an inch. And when you think of a light taper and 6 pieces going into it, it takes a lot of dexterity, it takes a lot of patience, takes a lot of coordination. What else goes with that? Musicians. They were all musicians. They all played in the Bangor band. They were part of the community. And it's really interesting. So I convinced him that we should go out and find the remains of the Thomas Rod Company. And I ended up down in New York State with the fellow that had bought it out. And I purchased from him for the state of Maine everything that he would sell. He wouldn't sell the tapering machine. I think it's still being used. But a lot of the hand tools, a lot of the parts and pieces. And that's why the Thomas Rod Company was in the Made in Maine exhibit. And again, I was able to, at the time, go out and look for other parts of other collections. Cornelia Thurston Crosby, Maine's first guide, a woman from Phillips, Maine, whose health wanted her to be in the outdoors, and she grew to love the outdoors. And she came at a time at the turn of the century, the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, when railroads were really big. And the railroads loved her because she could go to the Sportsman's Show in her green skirt that was ankle length, because it would have been awful to show you other than your ankle. And she was a good spokesman. She wrote well, and she was a really interesting person. She was also a photographer. And her photographic collection is at the Maine State.
Oh, it is? I didn't know that.
And since then, others on the museum staff have written books about her, and she's a much more prominent person than she was in the 1970s as a result of that. There were lots of things that happened at the museum. I was drawn into an archaeological project that was something I knew very little about at the time. Literally, within several weeks of the time I arrived there.
What was it, Steve?
I was setting up in my lab, opening boxes of tools, and my director came down and asked me to join him in another room with a big sink. And I looked into the sink that had jet black water in it. And he reached down and he pulled out a piece of waterlogged wood and some corroded iron. And it was all from the shipwreck that was part of the Revolutionary War expedition where privateers came up the coast from Maine to try to push the British forces out of Castine. And it ended in the first naval engagement of the war, which the Americans lost badly. The British ships were able to, kind of literally blow them out of the water. One of them went behind Sears Island and was part of an archaeological project that I became involved in for about the next 10 years.
Fascinating.
And so I had to design new technology, new treatment technologies, and work on that as well as what I'd been trained for, so that the work at the Smithsonian had given me confidence and people to call and colleagues to work with to bring new technology. I traveled. I got a grant. I went to a conference in Stockholm, Sweden, where they were working on the Vasa, which is a great Swedish ship that literally sank on launching and was in Stockholm Harbor. But that was a national priority, and they had hundreds of people staffed full-time for decades, which the state of Maine was unable to do with the defense. There's just not that important a project overall. So there have been a lot of things that I have done in my career that are just common sense things, and it's working with common sense and science to solve problems.
Before we take a break, Steve, there was a period of your life, about 10 years, I know that you mentioned this to me before, where you decided to get into just open your own consulting business.
That came after I was laid off at the museum.
Oh, I didn't realize you were laid off. So this was probably following the McKernan.
Well, it was part of the budget crunches and time. And at the time, we'd finished most of the work on the defense. And conservation just was not the high priority for the institution. So they laid me off, and I had to scramble and set up my own business. And that's when I started working on the murals, and I moved a set of murals from Reed Field over to Vermont.
So you were commissioned by Colby College or commissioned by some gallery or a museum?
I was commissioned by others to do work and worked in private. That's private practice.
Yes.
And I didn't want to set up a laboratory here because that would have been a very complex and expensive process. So I limited my practice to what I could do to stabilize things and help things move forward. And I did that for 10 years, but I also started at that time to spend more and more time volunteering for a group called the Kennebec Coalition. And I think we'll get to that after the break.
That's a great place for us to come back to, Steve, and I appreciate that. Thanks for sharing everything you did so far. This Flyline flashback focuses on the book The Maine Woods, written by Henry David Thoreau, originally published in 1864. Henry Thoreau traveled to the backwoods of Maine in 1846, 1853, and 1857. Thoreau wrote The Maine Woods telling of those journeys through a rugged and largely unspoiled land. His travels on each trip began by train, eventually switching to coach, and eventually on foot and over water by canoe. Thoreau commissioned his guide to carry the necessary provisions as well as lead the party through the river passages across the length of Moosehead Lake to Northeast Carey and across the Carey to the upper west branch of the Penobscot drainage, where they would ultimately paddle the Penobscot back downstream to Bangor, passing through what is known today as Baxter State Park and Mount Katahdin. In the book, Thoreau brings the reader along as he paddles a canoe, hikes mountains, dines on cedar beer, hemlock tea, and camped and lived vicariously through the companionship of his native Penobscot guide. In each of his journeys on these trips, Thoreau took extensive notes, capturing the place names given by the native guide, as well as the colonial names of places like Pine Stream. In this story, Thoreau tells about moose hunting, setting up camp, the running of rapids, portaging of falls, as well as sleeping under a cotton tarp, until the tarp burned, resulting in the party sleeping under an overturned bateau. Throughout the story, Thoreau sprinkles observations about the thick forest, the sounds of the wilderness, and the wild creatures they encountered, offering the Latin names for the flora and fauna he was discovering and observing along the way. In the same story, Thoreau carefully combines his admiration for the wonders and complexities of nature and contrasts that with the destructive nature of modernism and taming the wilderness by cutting down the trees for profit, as he observed firsthand through his non-approving lens as a budding naturalist. The author Paul Thoreau expressed Henry Thoreau's position best in that Thoreau's impassioned protest against the despoilment of nature in the name of commerce and sport, which even by the 1850s threatened to deprive Americans of the tonic of wilderness. Henry David Thoreau was born in 1817 in Concord, Massachusetts, and passed away in 1862, 2 years before The Maine Woods was eventually published and released to the public. And now, back to the second half of our episode. So, Steve, thank you for sharing all of that about your history and working as a conservator and working with a museum. But then you started working with rivers. How did that start to come into your orbit? Your background really, it wouldn't be a logical next step, but it certainly was a perfect fit for you.
Well, one day when I was working at the museum, I was lining paintings on a vacuum hot table, which means that you can listen. And I had a big radio system, and I was listening to a speaker from the College of the Atlantic. And it was a graduation address, and he challenged the graduates to give a year of your life to something you believe in. I thought, wow, that sounds pretty interesting. I can do something like that. So as we started talking about the Kennebec and taking out the Edwards Dam, it all began with people like John McLeod, Peter Thompson, and two others that were on their way for a fishing trip, and they started talking about what would the Kennebec look like? What would happen to the Kennebec if we took the Edwards Dam out? Nobody knew. Nobody had the faintest idea how to do this. So the Edwards Dam effort started as a grassroots effort from the Kennebec chapter of Trout Unlimited.
And you remember.
And I was a member, and I was interested in it. And I thought, I need to learn more about the Kennebec. I need to learn more about Atlantic salmon. So I attended a conference at L.L. Bean's, and John Echevarria, who was an attorney for American Rivers at the time. And I started talking at lunch, and he said, I've got a couple $1,000. I'll bet you guys could use that. I'll bet that you could use that as seed money and get going. So we formed the Kennebec Coalition, which is a coalition in name only. It's a coalition of convenience because it's so much easier to refer to it as one group, but it's really Kennebec Trout Unlimited, sometimes National Trout Unlimited, but not always. Natural Resources Council of Maine. It started with American Rivers, and now it's Maine Rivers. And it started with the Atlantic Salmon Federation that had sponsored the conference there.
Friends of Merry Meeting Day?
No,
Okay.
Ed Friedman and his group were not part of it. And
Okay.
that was intentional on our part because we knew that if we made it too big, we knew that if we made it too complicated, we knew that if we made it too constrained,
Sure.
it would be very difficult to do anything.
Yeah.
And the way it really ended up was Ron Kreisman, who was the general counsel at the Natural Resources Council of Maine, and I started kind of trying to figure out how we could really build a case against the Edwards Dam. We had a little bit of seed money. I was working as a consultant conservator at that point, and I just put the rest of the time that I had available to volunteer to put all of this together.
So for the audience, what was going on with the Edwards Dam in terms of it? I'm thinking in the mid to late 90s, Steve. Oh, well, really in the early 90s is probably when you started working on this.
Well, when you start talking about hydropower dams, you have to start talking about the license that they get from the federal government, because they get a long-term license. They get a long-term license that usually expires on a 40-year cycle. That's about what it was. When Teddy Roosevelt set up all of this way back in the day, the hydropower industry said, we want these licenses to be forever. But Teddy Roosevelt said, no. Rivers change, priorities change. You're going to get a long-term license so you can amortize all of your investment.
Yeah.
And that's what it turned out to be. And the Edwards Dam's license to generate power was going to expire. And it was going to expire in 1992, actually.
Okay.
And they put in to renew the license. And the federal energy regulatory process for licensing is complicated, and it takes years to do, and they knew that. And so the contract was extended to sell the power in the same way that the contract was extended to create a new license.
Mm-hmm.
And it took from the late 1980s until 1998 to really work out with the owner of the dam that it was in his best interest to sell it, and it was to be sold to the state of Maine for $1. He had the rights to all of the equipment on the site, and he held an enormous auction after the site was decommissioned on January 1st of 1999. And at that point, the state owned the Edwards Dam, the old mill site, which was in fact a hazardous waste site because of all of the chemicals that had come from the cotton mill over many years. And the mill had burned, and the that's how the Edwards Dam settlement finally was teed up.
So I can see you making an argument during the licensing process that it's not generating enough revenue in terms of its hydroelectric generation when you compare that to the amount of environmental effect that it's having upstream, and it's preventing anadromous and diadromous fish from traveling through. I'm going to wear my marine biology hat for just a minute. Let's go back 30 years to my marine biology class with Dan Buckley up in Farmington. Steve, define for the audience, what is anadromous versus what is diadromous? And then that's going to open up a whole other.
So, yeah, there are lots of fish that move between fresh and salt water, and it's always on their spawning run when they come to reproduce. The diadromous fish spend their life in Maine and go back to the ocean to spawn. And there's only one on the East Coast here, and that's the American eel. There are a whole series of anadromous fish that spend their life in the ocean and come into freshwater to spawn. Mm-hmm. And they all go to different spots in the freshwater habitat. The American eel, heck, I've been fishing up at Baxter Park and found American eel in the ponds up there. They go wherever they can to grow large and to gain weight, to be able to go back to the ocean as a silver eel and to spawn in the Sargasso Sea, halfway between Florida and Bermuda. The other fish that come in go other places. There are some that don't go very far at all. They spawn right at the head of tide. The rainbow smelt is one of them, which would be the sea run smelt. Then you have the river herring, which are alewife, blueback herring, and American shad. They're cousins. They're very similar biologically, but they each use a different part of the ecosystem to spawn. The shad spawn in deep water that's slow moving, but has to be moving main stem rivers. These are fish that are active. They're 3 to 5 pounds. They're always on the move. They don't do well in small confined spaces. In historic times, they went all the way up into the Sandy River.
Right.
And we have lots of historic reference on that. But the Edwards Dam stopped them and blocked them right there.
Right.
So you have alewife. Alewife go up rivers and streams into lakes and ponds where they spawn. They do broadcast spawning in the lakes and ponds. The adults drop out after they spawn, and the juveniles spend the summer and go out in the fall. Then you have the blueback herring. The blueback herring are riverine spawners, but their eggs are adhesive in clusters, and they attach them to rocks with free-flowing water. So when we were living in Hollow, Mike, one of the things that is most important in my development, before Beth and I were married, and it would have been in the spring, it would have been probably in mid-June, around the solstice time. We were walking down along the Kennebec in the evening, and it was at dusk, and we were kind of just exploring the town and enjoying the river. We saw 2 enormous fish side by side rolling in the surface film. They'd come up and they'd roll, and then they'd disappear. And then a few minutes later, they'd come up and they'd roll together and disappear. I had no idea what they were. And the next day I went into work, and I had coffee in the shop every morning with the crew that worked down there. And a number of them were registered guides, and most of them had grown up hunting and fishing Merrymeeting Bay. And I said, what the heck did we see? And they made sure that I understood what the size was, given the distance. And they said, those had to be sturgeon. I'm thinking, sturgeon, wow, what a fascinating creature. And it came full circle for me last spring in June, when I found I was the first person to call in hundreds of sturgeon spawning in Cobussy Stream. These are enormous fish. They're 8 up to 10 feet long, maybe occasionally a little bit larger. And they were right underneath the 201 bridge spawning in a place that they've spawned since they've been here, not necessarily every year, but the name Cobussy is Abenaki, and it goes to where the sturgeon come, or where the sturgeon can be caught. And I'm sure that what we witnessed last spring was what drew many of the indigenous people to the mouth of Cobbessy Stream. So when I was watching all of the sturgeon spawning in Cobbessy Stream last spring, there were thousands of blueback herring along the margins of the river, all spawning at the same time, with the sturgeon in the deep water and the blueback herring up on the edges. Again, using the free-flowing water with oxygen to keep oxygen in the eggs until they can hatch out and go downstream and grow up larger down below in the estuary.
So what has changed in Cobbessy Stream that allows them to come back?
Well, the major change was the removal of the Edwards Dam, because the Edwards Dam impounded and made inaccessible most of their spawning habitat in the Kennebec. So when Edwards came out in the summer of 1999, the next spring, the sturgeon went all the way to Waterville.
Yes.
And since then, their population has just exploded in the Kennebec. And I think that's the biggest major change. But there could have been a number of other things that would have impacted that site, because transportation built a brand new bridge over Cobbessy Stream a year ago.
Okay.
So there was very fresh gravel, which is one of the things that sturgeon look for. We had very high flows that time of the year last year.
Yes.
Which put a lot of water in Cobbessy Stream. And it was really interesting because what got me to go there was there were fishermen fishing for striped bass on the flats down in the Cobbessy Stream just before when it goes into the Kennebec. And they were fishing for striped bass that were there feeding on blueback herring, which is another one of the alewife-like creatures, but they spawn in the river. Their eggs are adhesive. And as we were watching the sturgeon, I couldn't help but notice the hundreds of blueback herring that were spawning at the same time on the edges as the sturgeon were spawning in the deep water.
Incredible.
And the sturgeon's eggs, it's really interesting. They float downstream, but they're negatively buoyant. And so within 100 yards or less, they'll land on the bottom, and they have to land someplace where they're not going to be covered by silt.
Yes.
And in 10 days, they hatch out.
Oh.
And they float downriver and into the estuary. And the Kennebec is such an unusual river because there's an archipelago of islands that goes south from Bath on the eastern side of the Kennebec.
Yes.
The Back River, the Sasanoa River, the river, the Sheepscot River eventually. They're all interconnected in there. Yeah. So there's a lot of saltwater habitat with tidal estuarine situations that give place for these little teeny fish to grow up, and sturgeon grow very, very, very slowly. They'll grow 1/8 of an inch a year, or 1 inch a year at most when they're really, really big. The sturgeon that we watched spawning were between 15 and 20 years old, and they live up to be 75 years old.
Wow.
And so I think that the Kennebec on the sturgeon go together. And I've watched the Atlantic sturgeon along the beaches of southern Maine in the surf, feeding down there in the summer, and then the estuaries down there in the summer. But they come back to their spawning habitat. They come back to where they were spawned to reproduce. And because Edwards Dam was removed, the sturgeon population in Maine is doing very well.
The reason I asked, Steve, is for the audience, the Cobbessy Stream is below the Edwards Dam.
Yes, it is.
Significantly.
Yeah.
So really, we're talking more about if you just, I can't think of a good analogy, so I'm just going to say remove a dam. Upstream of another resource, you can affect it positively. It doesn't necessarily need to be, that was accessible for my it's always been accessible. Mm-hmm. There's never been a dam below Cobbessy.
That's right.
But there's several dams on Cobbessy.
Yes.
Right. I mean, I kayaked slalom race down through there years ago, and there was a number of dilapidated dams that I had.
Isn't that a great piece of whitewater?
You know, that's got a lot of potential. It really does. And, not just for fish, but in a lot of ways. But
I used to go down during lunch hour at the museum.
Yeah.
And we could paddle Cobbessy Stream twice during lunch hour.
During lunch break.
And I'll tell you, I don't know where you put in. We put in above the railroad trestle.
Yes, we did too.
And that turn against the concrete post in the middle of the river in an 18-foot canoe is exciting, I have to tell you.
The race would begin. I want to say there's a dam above the railroad.
Yes.
It's a metal railroad trestle.
Well, it's a wooden one.
Wooden one, okay.
Yeah.
And then there was a pylon right in the center of the river.
That's correct.
And then the race ended down just above where the A1 diner would be.
Yep.
So the Edwards Dam you felt was going to open up 19 miles, Steve? 17 miles? What is it?
Yeah. It's about 17 miles between the Edwards site and the Lockwood site in Waterville and Winslow.
Right. So the audience doesn't know, Steve really talked in the first part about being, his work with art and work with the museum and being conservator. But I know, Steve, that you really have a reputation in our community and in the state, and you have a legacy of being someone that really kind of lived in the crossroads between understanding what you just talked about, understanding, having a passion for understanding migratory fish and migratory species, and the impasse of what they need for reproductive success and the physical barriers that stand in the way, but more importantly, the potential opportunity that you could see through your own lens. And you saw something living above Edwards Dam, and you've seen other places around the state where you said, aha, if we do this, I think there's a real positive potential here. And you were motivated, driven, and always have been to get the word out.
Yeah, I'm an advocate. I do advocacy. I'm not a fisheries biologist. I try to communicate the importance of these sea-run fish so that everybody understands what we're missing. They're what are called keystone species. All the river herring are keystone species. That means if they're not present, the ecosystem changes dramatically. We've lost a lot of our offshore fishery simply because they don't have enough food to eat. And most of that food, actually, in fact, came from the rivers. Those big fish offshore used to come to the mouth of the Kennebec, the mouth of all of the rivers, to really gain weight, to hold over winter, as all of these juveniles were migrating out in the fall.
Mm-hmm.
So that there's known science and understanding. And, in the case of alewife, as an example, we've lost 97% of the biomass of alewife along the Atlantic coast. Mm-hmm. Think of what that means. These are fish that feed everything. They're great to eat if you've ever had smoked river herring. They're delicious. They're a little bit on the bony side, and you've got to be able to pick them out to pick the bones out. But for years, river herring were exported to feed plantation slaves in the South. That was the main export value of alewife and probably blueback herring as well. Barrels by the thousands. And in fact, Canada buys as many alewife as they can get.
Right.
And they can them. And they send it to the Caribbean as food aid where they're in high demand. So people learned about these fish for generations, and they still are in demand. Mm-hmm. They make the ecosystem complete. Come to the Kennebec during the run of alewife, and you'll see bald eagles. You'll see minks. You'll see otters. Mm-hmm. You'll see everybody coming to the river to partake of this biomass of fish that came in. And in fact, in historic times, all of Maine's indigenous people really lived off of these fish for a good part of the year. You go up Cobbessy Stream up into Annabessacook Lake, and there's an island that was an indigenous processing plant for drying fish. Why an island? Well, because there were wolves. There were other creatures that would have harassed them had it been on land.
Interesting.
And they figured it out immediately.
So, Steve, now FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has not granted a license for the Edwards Dam to continue. You had a green light at that point, you felt, for the potential of literally removing the dam. You had stopped the licensing of the power, but now you have the challenge of removing the dam. And that's when I really had a front row seat to watch you and the Kennebec Coalition and my local chapter of TU, the Kennebec TU chapter, really doing a lot of things. What do you remember back then?
Well, it's important to remember it wasn't just me.
No.
We had a team of pro bono attorneys that met weekly to develop the strategy and move forward. And we identified the need to identify a funding source to pay for the removal long before we actually had a settlement. And At that time, Bath Iron Works was moving from an inclined plane shipyard to a land level facility. And they had to disturb what was Atlantic salmon spawning habitat in the main stem Kennebec to dig out a hole deep enough for a dry dock to be able to launch a ship. And they decided that they were going to dedicate that money in a dedicated fund for the removal of the Edwards Dam. And that was done after a large group of NGOs who they called on had recommended that as the priority for mitigation for the BIW plant. So we were as surprised as anybody else was when the vice president from General Dynamics on a radio program one Friday afternoon announced that they were putting a large amount of money in a dedicated account to remove the Edwards Dam.
You must have just danced the jig.
And we thought it was pretty well set up. We'd attended a lot of meetings. We talked to a lot of people. We developed a lot of understanding of why this was important in that community that was looking at sturgeon habitat. It wasn't only that. They did a lot of other local habitat restoration area over on the Sasanoa River, on the bridge that goes up under Route 1 that they're going to be rebuilding this coming year because of sea level change. But all of that was something that was part of the effort of the Kennebec Coalition, and it was a very important step along the way.
One of the things I remember, Steve, is that listening to you and others talk about, hey guys, when the dam comes out, there's a few things that we're going to need to have volunteers moving mussels and clams. And you were also doing a lot of slideshows about what you felt the potential shoreline, how it would regenerate. Tell our listeners a little bit about, what you were explaining to people about what was going to be expected the day the dam went out following after that.
Well, again, it's all part of an ecosystem. And the dam that had been in place for over 100 years is going to have changed the ecology of the river significantly. And in fact, there were some endangered listed freshwater clams that were present in some of the habitat of the impoundment. And the water level was going to change and their habitat was going to be de-watered. So we asked for volunteers to come up and help dig them up and move them down into the lower level of the river when it had been returned to its real banks. Everything in Maine is a little bit different than some other big impoundments. Here in Maine, we have run-of-river dams, which means that the amount of water doesn't change because the dams are there. It just impounds them and it makes them deep. It makes them stagnant. In the summer, they're a lot warmer, so they have less oxygen. And the change from that to a fresh, free-flowing river is very dramatic. We really didn't know what to expect. Right. Nobody had ever done something like this, as large as this, on a major main stem dam anywhere in the world that we were aware of. But I tried hard to get some science in place before the dam was removed, but nobody would commit to doing it because we hadn't got the settlement inked on paper.
The removal of the dam was unprecedented.
It was unprecedented. It was an international priority, and it's something that we should all be very proud of because we've started something that can be made better. As we were understanding how this was going to happen, we could think of lots of things that could be different. Impoundments have mostly worms rather than aquatic insects. Aquatic insects support the fisheries, so the fisheries is different. And but we didn't really understand how quickly it would come back and how it would change. We couldn't find science that was willing to take the risk of undertaking 2 or 3 years of study, not knowing if the dam was going to come out. So we had to just proceed anyway. The spring after the dam came out, the total insect biology increased hundreds of folds.
Right.
It was more than anybody had ever seen in a river. And it's truth to the saying, nature abhors a vacuum. And in fact, what it was being sent downstream from above the impoundment was adequate to not only populate, but overpopulate the free-flowing river. And that tapered off over a period of 5 years, and now it's just the typical free-flowing river in a stable state.
So what, just for the audience and the listeners, when they're trying to establish the health of a river, I can't think of what the term is again. There's an acronym for it, but they'll put almost like a gravel pen in the bottom of the center of the river, and they'll count the amount of caddis, mayfly, stonefly. And that's what Steve's talking about in terms of the measurable health of a river improving.
Yeah, the Department of Environmental Protection has standards for this. And it really is governed by the oxygenation and temperature of the river. Impoundments can't hold the same oxygen that a free-flowing river does. Free-flowing rivers tumble over rocks, is always engaging and putting more air into the water. And that's what the cold water fish that live in that system need to have. So the rock basket is a test that Maine Department of Environmental Protection uses to determine part of the water quality of a river.
And I see them a lot on the Androscoggin.
Yeah.
Yep, that's pretty interesting.
So I think that a lot of the lessons that were learned with this precedent-setting effort at the Edwards Dam make me think about some of the mentors that I had to work with along the way. Because it was the Natural Resources Council of Maine was part of the Kennebec Coalition, they assigned 3 board members to meet with me on a regular basis. And they were, Bill Townsend, John Lund, and Ed Riggs, 3 people that I respect highly. Bill Townsend was an attorney in Skowhegan who just loved river herring and worked hard his whole career to restore them, primarily because river herring are critical if you're going to have Atlantic salmon in the river. John Lund, attorney in Augusta, who's the publisher of the Maine Sportsman still, turned into a very close friend. In fact, both Bill and John were very close friends. John is still with us. I used to fish Atlantic salmon with Bill Townsend up in Nova Scotia. And we'd go up into either New Brunswick or Nova Scotia, and he'd rent a property for 2 weeks and have a number of people that were interested in coming for 3 or 4 days come up. And that was a tremendous learning opportunity for me. I got to talk to people that really understood the species, and I got to catch a couple of Atlantic salmon and decided that they are better released today because they need the energy that they have to be able to spawn. I don't want them to waste it on just being caught and released for fun. John Lund and Bill Townsend and I, with John McLeod and with Peter Thompson, formed a group early on before we started really working as a Kennebec Coalition. And it was called the Kennebec River Anglers Coalition. And we met in John Lund's living room, and we just tried to suss out and figure out what needed to be done next as we went through the Edwards effort. And this was grassroots democracy at its best. Peter Thompson and I worked with people like Ira Ellis, who was the director of the Maine Cooperative Extension Office in Augusta. And we actually put forward 2 publications that Peter Thompson illustrated. One of them was, what are the fish of the Kennebec? Nobody had ever looked at the fish of the Kennebec. And we did profiles of all the species of fish as just information for the Augusta community. We then did a second publication the second year of what are the questions that needed to be answered before we can remove a big dam on a main stem. And so Ira was one of the mentors leading us through this process. The Kennebec River Anglers Coalition was short-lived because it was subsumed by the Kennebec Coalition as soon as the Kennebec Coalition.
You guys were brainstorming is what you were
We were
doing.
brainstorming and trying to understand what needed to be done. But again, it came from the people at the grassroots who'd originally thought about it, because that was, John McLeod and Peter Thompson and Dan Kamen and one other person. They were on a trip up north to go fishing one day together, and somebody asked, gee, why is the Edward Dam still in the river? It's generating virtually no electricity. Why is it there? And that's where the idea came from. And that idea was sold as a project to the Kennebec chapter of Trout Unlimited. And we spent a lot of time raising funds and talking about the issue and educating the community of the importance of restoring this ecosystem.
So Steve mentioned John McLeod, and John McLeod at the time owned a little fly shop that was in Belgrade, and then ultimately moved to Hollowell. But John was probably the ambassador fishing below the Edwards Dam. He was the guy that had the intel on what was going on, and he was a really, really outside of the box thinker.
Yeah, John was a Vietnam vet who came to the Augusta area and set up his shop. He had the first drift boat I ever saw in the state of Maine. It may have been the first drift boat being used on the river. And he used to row from his shop in Hollowell all the way up to Augusta as soon as the shop closed every day.
Wow.
And fish below the Edwards Dam until dark and float back down and be in the shop the next morning early to open the shop again.
That's a long row.
It's a long and challenging row when you get above the bridges in Augusta, because it's quite a bit of velocity up in there. John was very strong.
You can snake up through there. I can see how he could do it. And I fished below the dam while it was still there, because you had me take a number of people out in the process, media mainly, to have them see what this dam looked like. And it was it was a wide dam. It was a large structure. And I remembered, I know you were there. Can't remember if we talked that day, but watching Bruce Babbitt and Angus Kings, and we all stood on the West Bank and watched the excavator operator just take the first bite out of it and watching it flow. And you're right, a year later, and I want to tell you this, Steve, because I want to say thank you. A year later, I'm in the springtime, I'm coming down through to 6 Mile Falls, and you know where the cable car that goes across the river is just above that. Yeah. I'm anchored up. I'm with a couple of guys from Harpswell and a sturgeon. Yeah. It had to have been 6 or 8 feet long, breached the water. And I mean, if I had my oar out to the side, it would have hit my oar blade. Yeah. Scared the daylights out of us. We didn't know initially what it was. I thought it might have been an Atlantic salmon, but it wasn't. It was absolutely an Atlantic sturgeon. And then the next thing that happened is we dropped down below 6 Mile Falls, and we proceeded to catch what? Stripers. Yeah. A lot of them. Yeah. And then we start to drop down a little bit below that, and we start to catch, what does Jim Thibodeau refer to as poor man's tarpon? What are these guys with the square mouth? Herring, is it?
Yeah, they're river herring.
Yeah.
And they're probably American shad.
American shad, that's it.
Because they're 3 to 5 pounds. Those are exciting. They're known as the poor man's caviar.
That's what I'm thinking of, yeah.
And they're marvelous fish. They fight like bananas. And if you go up to Waterville today in the right time, you can probably catch 20 to 30 fish that'll strip your reel bare in half a day.
And we were doing that, and it was a blast. So now, I mean, it used to be just a smallmouth fishery above Edwards, and it turned into you didn't know what you were going to get.
That's right. Well, it's a dynamic fishery that has repopulated the river. The fish are there. They want to get to the habitat that they need to do. Yeah. And the fact that they've survived for over 140 years of the impoundment of the Edwards Dam, they've actually had adequate habitat downstream in Merry Meeting Bay, and then the streams that go into Merry Meeting Bay, to have a little bit of population that was still there. But American shad came back primarily because of effort stocking. A lot of those fish came up from Kennebec River and were raised in a hatchery by Sam Chapman down on the coast. I mean, the effort here goes far beyond any one individual. It has been an enormous effort by a lot of people that continues on this day.
What's your vision for the Kennebec moving forward?
I'd like to see free-flowing Kennebec as far as Madison, Maine. And the reason I say that is because the spawning habitat for Atlantic salmon in the Sandy River is unlike any other spawning habitat in the state of Maine for Atlantic salmon. It's at high elevation. It's up in Phillips. It's up all the way up into some of the tributaries that go off the Sandy and Phillips.
That's right.
All the way down up in to all of those tributaries. There's a lot of habitat, and there's been a big investment already in place in terms of protecting the land from development. The Atlantic Salmon Federation is doing a phenomenal job doing some small dam removals above Farmington.
Mhm.
And all of this is in preparation for getting Atlantic salmon to swim on their own rather than being trucked around 4 dams that give very little power and do a lot of damage to an ecosystem that could be vibrant. Can you imagine the precedent that you'd be setting for taking out low head, low capacity dams that are on the coastal plain along our rivers? We've lost all of the fisheries in our rivers on the Connecticut, in the Merrimack, all of the big rivers south of us. They've failed to create functional fish passage at dams. And it's not surprising because it's not just fish passage that's needed. The fish have to get up there quickly because they're starving. They're on the spawning run where they do not eat. They have to carry all of the biomass that they need to go to spawn, which is very, very hard work, and then to get back to the ocean before they feed.
Instead of sitting below a dam trying to find where that ladder is.
That's correct. And it's finding where the fish passage is that's the major problem. And that's because these rivers flow a lot, and the fish are going to go to wherever the water leads them. It's very interesting when you see a site like the Lockwood Dam. Once a year, they've had to.
Where is the Lockwood Dam?
The Lockwood Dam is between Waterville and Winslow.
Thank you.
And it's an L-shaped dam that goes across the river. It's long, it's complicated, and it creates an enormous amount of spill. And how those fish are going to find a little teeny entrance on the east side that's to a fish lift is beyond anybody's comprehension. And find it within 24 hours, because that's about all the time that they can spend in warmer water looking for something before they can move up into cooler water in the pools and free-flowing rivers that can be above it.
So is the Lockwood Dam the first dam in Waterville, or is it the Hathaway Dam? Or
well, the Lockwood Dam is the first dam on the Kennebec.
So that's where they're getting trucked from there then.
They're getting trucked from there if they find the entrance to an elevator that leads to a tank that leads to a truck that can take them upstream.
Yeah.
And to rely on humans to do something that they want to do on their own doesn't make sense ecologically, and it doesn't make sense cost-wise. It's cost prohibitive. And it's something that the hydro industry has successfully argued against for a long time. We had more returning Atlantic salmon than we've ever had this last year on the Kennebec. The population is there and it's ready to build. It needs access to its spawning habitat.
So along the way, Steve, you don't want to take as much credit. You want to distribute it around, and it deserves to be distributed around. But what were some of the lessons that you learned along the way?
Well, when we took out the Edwards Dam, we had no idea how it was going to react, how the Kennebec was going to react. And we've had phenomenal success with some of the river herring that can get up into the Sebasticook River. We've had enormous success with the Atlantic sturgeon and the short-nosed sturgeon. The populations of them are coming back dramatically. It is an interconnected ecosystem. And I think that we've got to start learning from things that we've tried in the past that haven't worked. We've tried single species restoration. Well, a lot of these fish have evolved together over thousands and thousands of years. They're co-evolved species. Take clams, for example. Freshwater clams don't move very far, but they only move one direction in general, and that's downstream. How do the juveniles get back upstream? Well, somehow they sense the presence of incoming sea-run fish before they release their spat into the water column. And their spat connects to the gill rakers on all of these fish, some of them just one species of fish, and they go upstream with the fish. So part of having clean and healthy water is having all of the clams to do the filtration of the water, because their impact is enormous. There are some that live in lakes and ponds. There are some that live in rivers and streams. They don't live in the main stem Kennebec simply because they can't get there, and it really is an impact on the water quality. I think that our world is really like a spider web, And when we touch one part of it, the whole thing can wiggle. And touching one part of it could be eliminating a species from it. And that makes the whole thing different and collapse. I think that big projects like the removal of the Edwards Dam, like the work on the Penobscot that tried to create fish passage around multiple dams, are really worth the effort. And I think that we think too short term. The indigenous peoples have always thought in terms of 7 generations when they talk about impacting the environment. What is the impact going to be in 7 generations from now? We're too focused on the dollar and the short-term impact of things. So I guess I'd ask us to be much more thoughtful of what we're doing that can change things, and how, if we change them, we can bring them back to a balanced situation. You're never going to get it back to the way it was. I think that partnerships work. This is something that the Kennebec chapter of Trout Unlimited brainstormed up with the Edwards Dam. And we formed a partnership with the Kennebec Coalition. And the Kennebec Coalition that we had during Edwards has evolved. And now we have different groups involved, but the effort is still the same, and that's to restore the sea-run fish to the Kennebec's ecosystem. I think that the partnerships are important to build, even if it means making compromise. And you can't expect to get it all at once, but you can make it better at each stage as you work on this. And it's going to take effort and time for people over a long period of time. And I think that we have to be much more thoughtful as we pick projects to work on. It's very nice to be able to engage ourselves in easy-to-do projects like planting trees along riverbanks to stabilize the banks in high water flows. And we're going to have a lot of high water flows as the climate continues to change around us. We've had like 9 inches of rain in January so far. I mean, that's pretty amazing for a half a month, especially in midwinter. That's very different. And I think that we've got to look ahead and be informed, understanding what is the best information available today, because that's going to change moving forward. So approaching it thoughtfully, approaching it with science that helps us understand where we are today, and being open-minded to understand that that understanding is going to change as we move forward. We're working to restore fisheries in Cobbessy Stream. We've got 3 dams that are still present in downtown Gardner. One of them holds back Pleasant Pond, and that's never going to come out. You have to have fish passage there.
Why do you say it's never going to come out?
Because the real estate values around that pond are high, and they create a tax basis for the communities that own it. That's why there are 3 municipalities that own that New Mills Dam. And I think that it's important to recognize the reality of some dams you're not going to be able to take out for multiple reasons.
Okay.
So you have to find ways that will work. And that means using most of the water that comes over the dam to create the fish passages that are needed so the fish that can get there. The middle dam there is licensed by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. It generates a small amount of electricity. That dam has in its license with the federal government terms that require them to build fish passage when the fish arrive at the base of that dam. So we go downstream and we have a dam that is an early paper mill dam from the 1840s, one of the earliest paper mills in the state. And it's made out of granite, cut granite rock. It's stable, but fish can't get past it. I can take you there in the spring and I can show you that dam covered with baby American eels trying to find a way along the wetted section of the dam. That dam kills all of those eels because they end up being eaten because they can't get upstream.
Right.
That's wrong. We need the eels in the system to be part of the ecosystem, to do what they do for the ecosystem. We need to have the other herring that are blocked by that dam above that dam. So we're trying to make a settlement somehow that will help the river's ecology and the ecosystem become better, because the Cobbessy watershed can create an enormous run of river herring that can feed the offshore fishery, that can feed the birds of the air, that can feed the people that care to eat alewife, and that there are markets for all of those things. So thinking through the whole, working at it consistently, being patient, and understand that you can only take one step at a time, but you've got to keep at it. You've got to keep working. You cannot give up. And I think that's my message to people that want to be part of this, because we can make a difference. We've proved that you can do it with Edwards. I think the owner of the Edwards Dam would just say today it was the best thing that happened to him, because he was able to come out with an enormous amount of revenue from all of the artifacts or the equipment that was there. He probably got a good tax write-off by giving the site to the state of Maine. There are benefits that come with dam removals for dam owners. And I think that that's what we need to be able to balance, the generation that they provide with the impact that they provide on the ecosystem.
If someone wanted to do, if they're listening to this podcast conversation and they wanted to do something meaningful, Steve, what could they do?
Well, you become involved. You just say, I want to learn about this. And you start asking questions. What's there? Why is it there? How does it work? Does it work? And then you start building the grassroots around you with others that think the same way, so that you can go to the state agencies and you can say, gee, we have a group of 1,000 people that want to do this. How can you help us make this happen? Right. And I think that it's a combination of helping the agencies that control all of these functions understand what the people want to have done to make it work for them. And I think that that's one of the grassroots of democracy and what really can work.
It sounds to me like that commencement speech that you listened to from the College of the Atlantic was a life-altering experience. It started to guide your principles. You've been a pillar of influence in my life and for a lot of the Maine guides that know you and people in the fishing community. You have passion, Steve. You have core principles. You've done a lot for advocacy. You're understanding and learning. I mean, you're not a scientist, but you've learned a tremendous amount about the ecosystems, especially along the Kennebec. And you spoke about the web of diversity and how it's all interconnected. And I just think it's magic what you've done, not just you, but the group that you've grown around you. And I just want to applaud you for the work that you've done. And you will be going down as a legend and as a luminary for the Kennebec River. And thank you for joining me today.
No, thank you, Mike. That's very generous.
That brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you for joining us for this intimate discussion. And thank you for listening to Flyline Podcast. A new Flyline Podcast episode will be released every 2 weeks on Tuesdays. So be sure to come back to meet our next famous guest. Until then, this is Michael Jones, and we invite you to visit the blog section of our website to enjoy photos and contributions from our guests and experience all of our episodes at flylinepodcast.com.